April 11, 1961, Jerusalem. The deathly silence inside the People's House was about to be shattered by cries of horror. A 55-year-old man walked calmly toward a bulletproof glass booth as hundreds of eyes watched him with pure hatred. Adolf Eichmann, the man who organized the transportation of millions of Jews directly to the gas chambers, would finally face those of his victims who had survived. For 16 years, he had lived in hiding in Argentina under a false identity. For 16 years, families torn apart by the Holocaust had waited for justice. Now, the accountant of death stood just meters from people whose parents, children, and siblings he had sent to their deaths. Could you look into the eyes of the man who planned your family's death? Stay until the end to hear Eichmann's chilling final words before his execution. Before we begin, we are working toward a goal of 1 million subscribers. It may sound ambitious, but with your help, we can reach it. Subscribe now, leave a like, and become part of this story. Eichmann's escape. May 1960, Buenos Aires, Argentina. On a cold late afternoon, a man steps off a bus on Garibaldi Street in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. His pace is calm, almost routine. He wears thick glasses and a well-worn jacket and carries an aging leather briefcase. He calls himself Ricardo Clement. He works as a department head at the Mercedes-Benz factory. His neighbors see him as reserved and punctual, a man with few pretensions, an ordinary German immigrant. But it is all a lie. Ricardo Clement is the false identity of one of the world's most wanted war criminals, Adolf Eichmann, the logistical architect of the final solution, the systematic plan that exterminated millions of Jews during the Holocaust. How did this man, one of the central cogs in the Nazi regime, end up so far from a Europe devastated by war? To understand how this happened, we must return to the chaos of 1945. With Germany in ruins and the Third Reich collapsing, many Nazi officers fled in desperation to avoid the war crimes tribunals. Eichmann was among them. He knew that if captured, he would probably be hanged like the others tried at Nuremberg. His escape would come through the so-called rat lines, clandestine networks that smuggled former Nazis out of Europe under false identities. These escape routes were no mere rumor. They were real. Some were improvised by former members of the SS. Others, however, received assistance from respected and powerful institutions, including the Catholic Church and even the International Committee of the Red Cross. Difficult as it may be to imagine, these organizations played a crucial role in helping war criminals escape. The most effective of these escape routes was the so-called Vatican route. From within the Vatican walls, the Austrian bishop Alois Hudal, known for his Nazi sympathies, provided spiritual and logistical assistance. Hudal used his position to issue letters of recommendation, arrange accommodation in monasteries, and, above all, help fugitives obtain false identity papers bearing the Red Cross seal. Through this route, Adolf Eichmann obtained a safe conduct pass issued in Genoa, Italy in 1950. Armed with a new identity and valid documents, he sailed for South America. His choice of destination was no accident. Why Argentina? During the final years of the war, and even after it ended, Juan Domingo Perón's regime had shown sympathy for the Nazi cause. Documents released decades later, along with investigations by journalist Uki Goni, indicate that a tacit agreement existed between members of the SS and elements of the Argentine intelligence service. Argentina offered refuge, anonymity, and the chance to begin new lives in exchange for technology, influence, and money. Among the thousands of fugitives who arrived in Buenos Aires after the war were doctors, engineers, intelligence officers, and murderers. Eichmann blended into this crowd. For the next several years, he kept a low profile. He worked as a laborer and was later promoted. He rented a modest house on Garibaldi Street. In 1952, he brought his wife and children over from Austria, completing the appearance of an ordinary immigrant family. He never spoke of the past and never dared attract attention. But he was not a free man. He was a fugitive. For nearly a decade, the world forgot Adolf Eichmann. Chance did not. It all began with a romance. Eichmann's eldest son, Klaus Eichmann, still used the family's original surname. Young, impulsive, and indiscreet, he met and began dating Sylvia Hermann, an Argentine teenager whose father, Lothar Hermann, was blind and had survived the Dachau concentration camp. When Sylvia mentioned that Klaus's father was German and that his surname was Eichmann, something clicked in Lothar's mind. He knew that name. It was no ordinary name. It belonged to the man who had organized the mass deportations, signed extermination orders, and been reported missing. Lothar Hermann immediately grew suspicious. He began gathering evidence, and his suspicions eventually reached the right man, Fritz Bauer, the courageous chief prosecutor of the West German state of Hesse. A Jewish survivor, Bauer had devoted his life to hunting Nazi fugitives. Bauer knew that if he trusted his own government colleagues, many of whom had served under the Nazi regime, Eichmann would escape once again. So he made a radical decision and contacted the Israeli government. Israeli officials, led by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, assessed the report. But they soon encountered an obstacle. Extradition was impossible. Argentina did not recognize war crimes as legal grounds for extradition. The failure to capture Joseph Mengele, Auschwitz's doctor of terror, was still fresh in their minds. The solution? A covert operation. Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, assembled a special unit of 11 agents. Their mission was to confirm Eichmann's identity and bring him back alive to stand trial in Jerusalem. It was a dangerous operation with no guarantees, illegal under international law, yet a moral imperative for a people still bearing the scars of the Holocaust. Agent Zvi Aharoni, whose family had been exterminated by the Nazis, was the first to go into action. He traveled alone to Buenos Aires, watched Eichmann for days, compared photographs, and studied his habits. After weeks of surveillance, there was no longer any doubt. The man living on Garibaldi Street was indeed Adolf Eichmann. May 11, 1960. Night was falling when Eichmann stepped off the bus. As usual, he walked absent-mindedly. A few meters from his home, 3 agents surrounded him. The attack was swift, silent, and calculated. Eichmann tried to shout, but they overpowered him within seconds. He immediately admitted who he was, one of the agents recalled. There was no resistance. It was as though he had been expecting this. For the next 10 days, the agents held him at a safe house while they waited for a flight operated by El Al, the Israeli airline, which was taking part in a diplomatic mission. To get him aboard without arousing suspicion, they drugged him and disguised him as an ailing diplomat. On May 23, 1960, the world heard David Ben-Gurion announce before the Israeli parliament, "Adolf Eichmann is on Israeli soil." The revelation sent shockwaves around the world. To some, it was a triumph of justice. To others, an international scandal. Debates over sovereignty, international law, and memory began to dominate the newspapers. But for the survivors, there was no doubt. For the first time, the executioner would stand face to face with his victims, not on the battlefield, but before the tribunal of history. And as the world reacted, Eichmann waited in silence for what would come next. But what happens when one of the chief architects of the Holocaust is finally brought to trial? To understand the trial, we must first understand the accused. Adolf Eichmann was not born a monster, nor was he an executioner destined for evil from the cradle. As he himself liked to say, he was an ordinary man, seemingly mediocre, with adequate but unexceptional intelligence, who never served on the front lines or belonged to the upper echelons of the Nazi regime. Yet it was precisely this ordinariness that would make him so dangerous. The son of a Protestant company manager, Eichmann grew up in Linz, Austria, the same city where Hitler spent part of his youth. Even as a young man, he showed little intellectual promise. He repeated a school year, abandoned his studies, and failed in nearly every career he attempted. He worked in oil sales and as a shop assistant, but never distinguished himself. Above all, he was a man without direction. And perhaps it was this very lack of direction that left him vulnerable to the power of totalitarian ideologies. In 1932, at the age of 26, Eichmann joined the Austrian Nazi Party, drawn more by a sense of belonging than by any deep ideological conviction. It was a time of crisis, uncertainty, and national humiliation. The following year, after Hitler came to power in Germany, Eichmann found his path. He joined the SS, the feared Schutzstaffel, and there discovered his calling within the bureaucratic machinery of terror. He was assigned to the Gestapo's Department of Jewish Affairs. At first, his mission was simply to expel Jews from German territory. This was state-sponsored anti-Semitism in its embryonic stage. He devised plans to deport Jews to Madagascar, to Palestine, or anywhere else beyond the Reich. The objective was clear: to empty Europe of Jews. It was still a policy of expulsion, brutal, but not genocidal. But as the war intensified and the Nazi occupation expanded, the logistics of mass deportation became unworkable. Europe was in flames. Borders were closing. Ships had nowhere to go, and the ghettos were beginning to overflow with corpses and hunger. Then the plan changed. In January 1942, the Wannsee Conference was convened at a lakeside villa outside Berlin. There, 15 men, lawyers, military officers, bureaucrats, and representatives of the Nazi elite gathered to formalize the so-called final solution to the Jewish question: systematic extermination. The meeting was brief, businesslike, and devoid of emotion. There were no votes or heated debates, only agreements among soft-spoken men with polished manners. By the end, Eichmann had not only recorded every word, but had also left the room with responsibility for putting the plan into action. He would coordinate the trains, thousands of them, that would carry millions of men, women, and children to extermination camps. He was the logistical architect of the genocide. We returned to Jerusalem in April 1961. 19 years after that fateful morning in Wannsee, Adolf Eichmann sat inside a bulletproof glass box at the center of an improvised courtroom in the People's House Theater. The structure had been built with meticulous care and kept under tight watch. It seemed almost theatrical, but what was at stake was anything but a performance. I saw him there, so ordinary, so trivial, Jeff Cohn would recall. The young American had managed to get a ticket to one of the sessions. It was like seeing an office clerk, not a war criminal. Yet that contrast was what made it so unsettling. The executioner who organized the deaths of millions did not look like a villain. He wore a gray suit, maintained a rigid posture, and answered in short sentences. A technocrat, an administrator of barbarity. Why did Israel want to put Eichmann on trial? Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion wanted more than justice. He wanted remembrance and education. He wanted to confront the collective trauma of the Jewish people, not only as victims of the Shoah, but as survivors with a voice. At Nuremberg, the victors had judged the defeated. In Jerusalem, a persecuted people would judge its tormentor. In the words of prosecutor Gideon Hausner, the Eichmann trial would be the trial of the 20th century. And Hausner had a clear plan: to give the victims faces, names, and voices. This would not be merely a parade of documents, but a public act of remembrance and dignity. The turning point came with the decision to allow the entire trial to be filmed. The idea came from American producer Milton Fruchtman, and after heated debate, Ben-Gurion agreed. Discreet cameras were installed, and the whole world watched. For the first time, the Holocaust was no longer just a dark stain in history books. It became image, sound, and emotion brought directly to the public. It was a new kind of justice, broadcast live. It was also the first time Holocaust survivors had testified publicly. Michael Podschlebnik took the stand and described clearing corpses from the gas vents. Yehuda Bekon spoke of his father's ashes at Auschwitz. Abba Kovner recounted his armed resistance in the dark streets of the Vilnius ghetto. Others described the long marches, the packed trains, the constant smell of burning flesh, the hunger, the cold, and the loss. The cameras captured it all and broadcast it to a world that had never before heard the horror described so starkly. For Israeli society, it was transformative. Many could not understand how Europe's Jews had been massacred with so little resistance. The trial revealed the painful truth. There had been no passivity. There had been desperation, fear, attempts to escape, and acts of heroism. But against the machinery of death created by men like Eichmann, few had any chance. Then came the defense, and with it, the abyss. Befehl ist Befehl. Orders are orders. That was Eichmann's line of defense. He was merely an official, he claimed, a logistics technician. He had never killed anyone with his own hands, never pulled the trigger. He had only coordinated the trains. He had no choice. But there were gaps in that account, and the prosecution knew how to exploit them. Evidence emerged, documents bearing his signature, records of meetings, deportation orders. Then came the bombshell, the recordings made by Wilhelm Sassen. Sassen was a former SS officer living in exile in Argentina who had persuaded Eichmann to record his recollections. On the tapes, Eichmann not only admitted his direct involvement, he took pride in it. He said he was disappointed that he had failed to complete the job. He called himself an idealist, not a bureaucrat. With coldness and vanity, he acknowledged his part in the killing, but there was something darker still. Budapest, 1944. When Himmler, yes, Himmler, ordered the deportations to Auschwitz halted, Eichmann defied him. He continued personally supervising the trains carrying Hungarian Jews to their deaths. One subordinate described his obsession as almost demonic. Eichmann did not simply want to follow orders. He wanted to complete the genocide. And then there were the children. In Paris, in 1942, Eichmann ordered the deportation of hundreds of Jewish children. None survived. During the trial, a former SS officer revealed something even more cruel. Eichmann had justified killing the children with cold logic. We must not leave alive those who may become future avengers. There, before the world, Eichmann was exposed not as a cog, but as a mastermind. Not as a passive executor, but as an active architect of the machinery of death. More than a legal proceeding, the trial was a dissection of the banality of evil. Eichmann was not some monster detached from reality. He was terrifying precisely because he was all too real. A man without charisma, without visible hatred, but blindly devoted to a murderous system. In the end, it was not his cruelty that shocked the world. It was his coldness. It was the fact that he could have been anyone. But the trial was not yet over. The verdict was approaching. The world watched. The witnesses had spoken, and the evidence was on the table. Now only one question remained. What would become of Adolf Eichmann? Before we reveal the outcome of Eichmann's trial, take a moment to make sure you are subscribed. Turn on notifications and leave a like. Your support strengthens our work and ensures you do not miss any of our upcoming stories. If you would like to see more content like this, write "I want more stories" in the comments. Your participation inspires us to continue and helps this video reach even more people. Now, take a deep breath and prepare to discover the ultimate fate of Adolf Eichmann. The sentence: The theater that had once hosted plays and concerts now became the stage for the most solemn of human decisions. The curtains were open, but this was no performance. There were no characters. There was history, and there was judgment. The silence in Jerusalem seemed to hold the breath of an entire world. Millions followed by radio and through discreet cameras mounted on the courtroom walls as justice delivered its verdict. The judge read in a firm but measured voice, "Guilty. Guilty of crimes against the Jewish people. Guilty of crimes against humanity. Guilty of war crimes." Adolf Eichmann, the man who had organized the railways of death with administrative precision, was sentenced to the maximum penalty, death by hanging. The trial had lasted 8 months. A court had been assembled to judge a man who had once seemed invisible. There had been 121 sessions, 1,500 documents examined, and 112 witnesses heard, each testimony like a knife cutting through the veil of oblivion. The voices of the victims, silenced for decades, emerged not as lamentation, but as accusation. In the end, no doubt remained. Eichmann was not an oblivious functionary, nor merely a cog turning without knowing where the machinery led. He was a willing executor, a man who planned, refined, and persisted, who ignored orders to stop, who complained that the work remained unfinished. Even so, he appealed. On March 28, 1962, the Supreme Court of Israel upheld the sentence. With every legal avenue exhausted, only a plea for clemency to President Yitzhak N4zi remained. Eichmann wrote in measured, almost formulaic terms. He claimed remorse and said he had been only an obedient cog in a larger machine. But it was too late. There would be no clemency. The president refused. And with that refusal came a rejection of the idea that neutrality could serve as a shield for horror. May 31, 1962, Ramla Prison. As night fell over Israel, a heavy silence hung over the prison. Eichmann wrote his final words. He asked for wine. He refused a rabbi. He said he was prepared. He remained arrogant to the end, perhaps not out of courage, but out of blind loyalty to the myth he had created about himself. At 11:58 p.m., he was led into the execution chamber. The officials were there. The doctors were there. History was there. Eichmann mounted the scaffold without visible hesitation. His final words, recorded by those present, were a grotesque echo of the nationalism that had guided him. Long live Germany! Long live Argentina! Long live Austria! These are the countries with which I most closely identified. I had to obey the rules of war and my flag. I am ready. At 12:15 a.m. on June 1st, the gallows did its work. There was no outcry, no crowd, only the quiet conclusion of a process that sought not revenge, but memory, justice, and truth. Eichmann became the only man ever legally executed by the State of Israel. It was a decision made not lightly, but with conviction. This was not the fate of a soldier. It was the end of an architect of death, a man who organized the disappearance of millions with bureaucratic coldness and personal zeal. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea beyond Israel's territorial waters. It was a symbolic and final act. Not even his memory deserved to rest in the land of his victims. The Eichmann trial did more than close a chapter in history. It marked a turning point, reshaping the course of international justice and becoming a milestone in humanity's moral consciousness. At Nuremberg, the Allies had tried the Nazi leadership, but the proceedings remained external to the survivors. They watched. In Jerusalem, the survivors spoke. They took the stand, named the dead, and described the indescribable. It was the trial in which collective trauma emerged from private diaries and became part of the public record. Memory became evidence, and silence was overcome. For the first time, survivors ceased to be mere numbers or anonymous figures. They became the central witnesses to historical truth. The tears shed in the courtroom were more than an expression of pain. They were an act of resistance. Every word, every recovered memory rescued the dead from oblivion. Israel tried a man for crimes committed elsewhere in the world against people of many nationalities. It was a legal watershed. Some crimes are so profound that they do not belong to one nation alone. They wound the very idea of humanity. Broadcast on television to dozens of countries, the trial entered homes, schools, and hearts. It became part of global culture. For the first time, the Holocaust was seen and heard not as a historical fact, but as lived experience, as a scar that remained open. Abraham Harmon, curator of an exhibition about the trial, would later say, "We show this so that people may know pure evil and understand that it can be defeated without sacrificing our humanity." Israel did not call the defendant Adolf Eichmann, only Eichmann. It was a deliberate gesture. By stripping him of his given name, Israel denied him a human identity. He was no longer an individual. He was a symbol, a warning. The greatest fear lay not in what Eichmann had done, but in who Eichmann was. He was not a wild-eyed sadist or a deranged tyrant, but an ordinary man who sat upright, spoke politely, quoted statistics, and obeyed orders. A man who hid behind protocols and saw trains, not bodies. Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial for The New Yorker, gave the disturbing essence of the case a name: the banality of evil. Eichmann was not an evil genius. He was the opposite, an ordinary bureaucrat, but a dangerously obedient one. He showed how evil can thrive, not through monsters, but through people who do not think. His trial was a mirror. It forced us to look not only at him, but at ourselves, at our institutions, our choices, and our vigilance. It reflected the worst of which human beings are capable, but also the best, the courage to seek justice, even when it comes late. And it left us with an essential question, one that still demands reflection today. In the face of cruelty, will we choose silence or truth? The answer is not found in books. It lies in the decisions made by each generation. Eichmann was hanged in 1962, but the evil he represented did not die with him. It takes on new names, new flags, and new rhetoric. It disguises itself as ideologies, systems, and routines. Sometimes it arrives in a suit, wearing an identification badge. At other times, it comes with polished words and a briefcase full of data. History has shown us the way. It is up to us to keep our eyes open and never, ever allow it to happen again. So what did you think of today's video? Did you already know the story of Adolf Eichmann and how it ended? Do you have any suggestions for future topics? Feel free to share them in the comments. Your input is always welcome. Thank you for watching to the end. If you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Subscribe, enable notifications, and leave a like. Before you go, take a look at the video appearing on your screen. It covers a fascinating subject that is sure to interest you. See you there.